In the dead of night, on August 17, 1943, nearly 600 British bombers appeared in the skies over a small Baltic peninsula. Their target, not a military base, not a factory, but the minds, the brilliant scientists behind Hitler's most terrifying secret weapon. Welcome to the story of Operation Hydra, the bombing raid that changed the course of World War II by targeting not just buildings, but brains. The Allied forces weren't just dropping bombs. They were desperately trying to erase an idea, a revolutionary technology that could have altered the outcome of the entire war. What happened that night would not only cripple Nazi Germany's most advanced weapons program, but would ironically set the stage for humanity's greatest peaceful achievement 2 decades later. This is the story of how destroying one launch site ultimately helped us reach the moon. By mid-1943, the tide of World War II was beginning to turn against Nazi Germany. The disaster at Stalingrad had shattered the myth of German invincibility in the East, while Allied bombing campaigns were steadily intensifying over German cities. Hitler was desperate for a wonder weapon, something so devastating it could reverse Germany's fortunes and force Britain to surrender. The answer was being developed at a secretive facility called Peenemünde, located on a remote Baltic peninsula. At the heart of this program was a 31-year-old engineering genius named Wernher von Braun. Despite his youth, von Braun was already directing Germany's most ambitious military project, the world's first long-range ballistic missile. We know it today as the V-2 rocket. What made the V-2 truly revolutionary was not just its destructive power. This was not merely another bomb, it was the dawn of a completely new era in warfare. Standing 46 feet tall and carrying a 1-ton warhead, the V-2 could travel at over 3,500 miles per hour, 5 times the speed of sound. It would climb 50 miles into the atmosphere before plummeting toward its target. Most terrifyingly, there was no defense against it. Unlike conventional bombers that could be shot down, the V-2 was essentially unstoppable once launched. No fighter plane could intercept it. No anti-aircraft gun could reach it. The first warning of its arrival would be the explosion itself, as it struck without any sound of approach. If mass-produced and deployed against London, these rockets could potentially kill thousands daily, while being completely immune to Britain's air defenses. The psychological impact alone might have been enough to break British morale and force a negotiated peace. The story of how Allied intelligence discovered Peenemünde begins with the Polish resistance. As early as 1942, reports had filtered through about strange experiments on the Baltic coast. But the breakthrough came from an unlikely source: aerial reconnaissance photographs taken by a lone RAF Spitfire flying at extreme altitude. On May 15, 1943, Flight Lieutenant Donald Steventon captured images of what looked like small aircraft without wings positioned on strange circular platforms. Photo interpreters at RAF Med Menhem were baffled until Der R.V. Jones, Britain's head of scientific intelligence, made the connection. These were not aircraft at all, but some kind of missile or rocket. Constance Babington Smith, one of the photo interpreters, later recalled the moment. When I finally identified that tiny rocket on the launching pad, I felt a cold shiver down my spine. We were looking at something entirely new in warfare. Confirmation came through intercepted German communications decoded through the Ultra program at Bletchley Park. The decrypts revealed not just the existence of the rocket program, but alarming details about its accelerating development timeline. British intelligence estimated that without intervention, V-2 attacks on London could begin within months. When Prime Minister Winston Churchill was briefed on the discovery, he immediately elevated Peenemünde to the highest priority target. This, he reportedly told Air Marshal Sir Charles Portal, must be destroyed at all costs. The race was now on. Could Allied bombers reach and destroy the facility before the rockets could be deployed against British cities? For the first time in military history, a major bombing operation would be launched not to destroy current military capability, but to prevent a future technological threat. Traditional military thinking had always focused on destroying enemy factories, infrastructure, and equipment. But Air Marshal Arthur Bomber Harris recognized that Peenemünde presented a unique challenge. The real target was not the machinery, but the scientific knowledge contained in the minds of its personnel. Harris developed an unprecedented plan, specifically target the housing areas where the scientists and engineers lived, rather than just the testing facilities. This was perhaps the first brain drain operation in military history, a deliberate attempt to eliminate intellectual capital rather than physical assets. The mission would be executed in 3 distinct waves. The first wave would target the scientists' housing estate, the second would hit the rocket factory and development works, and the third would bomb the experimental station. By staggering the attack, Harris hoped to catch German defenses off guard and prevent them from effectively responding. Timing was critical. Planners selected August 17 to 18 specifically because it offered a late-rising moon, providing just enough light for bombers to find their target while minimizing their visibility to German night fighters. The raid would begin precisely as the moon rose at 11:30 p.m. The operation would require massive resources. 596 aircraft, including Lancaster, Halifax, and Sterling bombers drawn from multiple RAF bomber groups. Nearly 2,000 tons of explosives would be dropped, including thousands of incendiary bombs designed to mark targets and start fires that would guide subsequent waves. Group Captain John Searby, who would lead the first wave as Master Bomber, faced a daunting challenge. The target was at extreme range for British bombers, leaving little margin for error in navigation or fuel consumption. Further complicating matters, to minimize civilian casualties in nearby occupied countries, the approach would need to be made entirely over the Baltic Sea, making it obvious to German defenses where they were headed. As Air Commodore Buffton noted in the final planning meeting, "We are asking these men to fly to the absolute limit of their range, to one of the most heavily defended targets in Europe on a mission whose importance they cannot even be told." At 9:25 p.m. on August 17, 1943, the first Lancaster bombers began rumbling down runways across eastern England. Within an hour, hundreds of aircraft were forming up over the North Sea, beginning the long journey toward Peenemünde. By 11:30 p.m., Group Captain Searby arrived over the target area, circling at 8,000 feet as the moon rose over the Baltic. Through breaks in the clouds, he could make out the distinctive horseshoe shape of the peninsula below. At exactly 11:42 p.m., Searby dropped the first marker flares, brilliant red cascades that illuminated the scientists' housing area. "Marker bombs on target," he announced over the radio. "Commence bombing run." The first wave struck the housing area with devastating accuracy. Within minutes, the quarters where Germany's top rocket scientists lived erupted in flame and smoke. But not all were there that night. Wernher von Braun himself later recounted, "I had been working late in the development hangar when the air raid sirens began. At first, we thought it might be another false alarm. Then the first bombs fell. Von Braun and several colleagues took shelter in a reinforced bunker as explosions rocked the facility around them. The precision was terrifying," he later wrote. "It was clear they knew exactly what they were targeting." By midnight, the second wave arrived, focusing on the production facilities. But German defenses were now fully alert. Searchlights swept the sky as anti-aircraft guns erupted in a barrage of flak. Worse, Luftwaffe night fighters had begun to arrive from nearby airfields. Major Wernher Straub, one of Germany's top night fighter aces, recalled, "We had never seen such a concentration of bombers. It was clear this was no ordinary raid. They were after something specific." The German fighters took a heavy toll, shooting down 40 British bombers. Inside one doomed Lancaster, wireless operator Frank Tilley managed a final transmission before his aircraft plunged into the Baltic. "Target hit. Engine on fire. God save thee." At 12:35 a.m., the third wave arrived, targeting the experimental test stands. By now, smoke and dust had obscured much of the target area, forcing pilots to aim through gaps in the billowing clouds. Several bombs struck the massive concrete test stands, where just days earlier V-2 prototypes had been undergoing final testing. By 1:15 a.m., it was over. The last British bombers turned westward, many with fuel gauges approaching empty after the long mission. Dawn revealed the extent of the destruction. Over 180 German scientists and engineers were dead, including Walter Thiel, the V-2's chief engine designer. Critical testing equipment lay in ruins. Prototype rockets had been destroyed. On the German side, the raid had destroyed irreplaceable expertise. On the Allied side, 40 bombers and their 215 crewmen were lost, a casualty rate of nearly 3%, attesting to the mission's extreme danger. Der Josef Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, wrote in his diary that night, "A heavy attack was carried out on Peenemünde. Considerable damage was done and we suffered dead and injured. This is a real catastrophe, for it means a delay of 2 months at least in our launching the V weapons against England." When Hitler received the damage assessment the following morning, his reaction was volcanic. According to Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, the Führer flew into one of his infamous rages, accusing the Luftwaffe of incompetence and even suggesting treachery. Hitler demanded to know how the British had discovered the facility and immediately suspected spies and saboteurs. The paranoia triggered by the raid had far-reaching consequences. Hitler ordered the immediate relocation of V-2 production to a supposedly impregnable underground factory called Mittelwerk, built into the Harz Mountains. Thousands of concentration camp prisoners would die constructing this facility and assembling rockets in its ghastly tunnels. Physical damage at Peenemünde was severe, but not catastrophic. Approximately 35% of all buildings were destroyed or seriously damaged. More significantly, the death of Walter Thiel created a leadership vacuum in the engine development program that proved impossible to fill. Field Marshal Erhard Milch assessed the situation bluntly. "We have lost at least 3 months, possibly more. The housing can be rebuilt, the machines replaced, but the mines we lost cannot be." The raid had achieved its primary objective, delaying the V-2 program during a critical period. Originally scheduled to begin in September 1943, the first operational V-2 attack wouldn't occur until September 8, 1944, a full year later. By that time, Allied forces had already landed in Normandy and were advancing toward Germany. General Dwight D. Eisenhower later called the Peenemünde raid one of the most significant air operations of the war, and estimated that it had saved many thousands of civilian lives in London. British Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Tedder was even more direct. In the cost-benefit analysis of strategic bombing, no other raid produced more decisive results for fewer losses. When V-2 rockets finally began falling on London in September 1944, their impact was severe, but too limited to change the war's outcome. Over 3,000 civilians were killed by approximately 1,400 V-2 strikes on Britain and Belgium. A terrible toll, but far fewer than would have died had the program launched a year earlier, as originally planned. As Allied forces advanced into Germany in early 1940, von Braun faced a crucial decision. The SS had orders to execute key scientists rather than let them fall into enemy hands. Recognizing that the war was lost, von Braun gathered critical documents and, along with his core team, deliberately surrendered to American forces. What followed was one of history's most extraordinary examples of scientific rehabilitation. Under Operation Paperclip, von Braun and over 1,600 German scientists were secretly brought to the United States to continue their work. Not on weapons, but initially on military missiles, and later on space exploration vehicles. Von Braun, the man whose V-2 rockets had terrorized London, would become the architectural genius behind America's space program. The Saturn V rocket that would eventually carry humans to the moon was a direct technological descendant of the weapons developed at Peenemünde. In a twist of historical irony, the same brilliant mind targeted for elimination in 1943 would, just 26 years later, make possible humanity's greatest achievement of peaceful exploration: the Apollo moon landing in 1969. Von Braun himself acknowledged this strange journey, famously remarking, "The rocket worked perfectly, except for landing on the wrong planet." He later reflected, "Science does not have a moral dimension. It is like a knife. If you give it to a surgeon or a murderer, each will use it differently." When Neil Armstrong took his giant leap for mankind, few viewers realized that the technology making that moment possible had its origins in a desperate bombing raid that had sought to prevent that very technology from ever being completed. The Peenemünde raid thus represents an inflection point in human history, an attempt to stop technological progress that instead redirected it. The bombs that fell that August night did not just reshape the war's timeline, they unwittingly helped set humanity on a path to the stars. Today, the technologies developed at Peenemünde underpin much of our modern world. 3 specific innovations trace directly back to this period. Inertial guidance systems, now used in everything from commercial aircraft to your smartphone's navigation. Multi-stage rocketry, which makes satellite launches and space exploration possible, and advanced fuel pumping systems, critical for modern aerospace. The ethical questions raised by Peenemünde and Operation Paperclip continue to resonate. Can we separate technical knowledge from the context of its creation? Should scientists bear moral responsibility for how their work is applied? These same questions now surface around AI development, genetic engineering, and autonomous weapons systems. Perhaps most relevant is how Peenemünde illustrates technology's dual nature. The same fundamental principles that can create weapons of mass destruction can also enable our greatest achievements. Today's space programs, satellite communications networks, and even weather forecasting systems owe their existence to work initially done for military purposes. As we face contemporary challenges like climate change and pandemic response, this historical lesson reminds us that technological development is not inherently good or evil. It's how humanity chooses to direct these capabilities that defines their ultimate impact. Operation Hydra, the bombing of Peenemünde, represents one of history's most consequential moments where military action, technological innovation, and ethical complexity converged. A single night's bombing literally redirected the trajectory of human progress. What technological developments today might we view differently with 70 years of hindsight? Are we condemning innovations that might ultimately benefit humanity, or embracing others that could prove destructive? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this deep dive into hidden history fascinating, hit that subscribe button and notification bell. Next week, we'll explore how a single failed assassination attempt in 1944 might have extended World War II by nearly a year. Remember, in the words of von Braun himself, science and technology have no conscience of their own. That conscience must come from us.